Hi guys, this is Dormouse03. Welcome to another episode of What's Pushing My Buttons. In this episode, I'm going to continue talking about survival horror and some of the things that I think could be taken from the older games and put into games today. And so the number one thing that I think that the games really nailed back, in the Resident Evil 1 and 2, Silent Hill 1 and 2 era was atmosphere. So you need a great atmosphere, a scary atmosphere. You need something that, it limits what you can see. And so in Resident Evil, it was, these buildings where there were these rooms and hallways and things, and you didn't know what was behind the next door. And in Silent Hill, I think they, in my opinion, did a better job of it by adding in things like it was really, really dark, and all you could see was what your flashlight illuminated, or the town was just very foggy, and you just couldn't see very far. And you had, this radio that would get static or whatnot whenever there was a monster nearby. And that was scary, because the monsters were so, mysterious and threatening, and that any one of them could kill you at any moment. You needed to know where they were. And when you're going through a dark hallway and you can't see anything, but that radio static is getting louder, you're like, oh, what's going to be up here? And so that atmosphere was fantastic. And so having something like that, where, you know what you're trying to go for, and you create your world to support that. And that doesn't mean that there has to be, blood all over the walls and, just gross things everywhere, or it looking like a dilapidated mess. Although those kinds of things can help set the tone and the atmosphere of whatever place you're in, that kind of stuff isn't necessary. I think it's more of this feeling of, well, I'm isolated in this place where there's all of these bad things, and I don't know where they are, and there's a lot of time where you're there aren't anything's present, but it's that anticipation of something being there that is scary. It's not the actual presence of something bad, it's the anticipation of something bad that's coming. And as long as you have the right pacing to that, and the right number of moments where there isn't anything but you fear that there might be, and the moments where there genuinely is something there, so that it isn't always just this big tease of like, well, there might be something here but there never is. As long as there are enough of the moments where there actually is something there to make it a legitimate tension, then I think that's great, and that's the kind of balance that you need to create this kind of scary atmosphere. Another thing that's really key is music and sound effects. Having the right composer and having the right kind of music and putting it in the right places. And I don't know, I feel like it's very minimalist, right? So in a lot of these places there isn't music, or it's very faint. Or there's just these sort of like grinding sound effects, or the static, or, footsteps down a hallway, or something like that, and you hear something off in the corner of your awareness, and you don't know what it is. I feel like those sorts of things are much scarier than, you're going through a corridor and it's silent, and then all of a sudden there's this loud bang and there's a monster in front of you. Yeah, obviously that's going to startle you, but I don't know, having the right mix of music and sound effects, and maybe you hear something and you're like, what is that? And there's never anything there. in some places. You hear a banging, or you hear a screeching, or you hear a crying, and you're looking around for it, and there's nothing there, And then the next time you hear something, there is something there. And so you never know when the sound effect is telling you the truth. Can really add to that level of tension. And so definitely having good use of music, good use of sound effects, and a good amount of pacing and spacing out those encounters with enemies, I think is key to making that kind of atmosphere that I feel like these older games did really well. Another thing that I think can still work in games right now is to not make your hero or your player character superpowered. I think that's a mistake that a lot of them make, is to make their hero seem more like the action star than just some everyday person who is put into this bad situation where they're then having to, survive and or fight their way out. So, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have bad mechanics so that it forces your player to not be able to fight or not be able to fight well, but it can simply be the matter of not having great weapons, or not having great weapons from the start, limiting the ammo, making sure that the enemies are deadly, that if you get caught unaware by something, or if you are looking at something and you've got 3 bullets in your gun, you've got to rethink this strategy of, how am I going to approach this enemy? Am I going to run from it? Am I going to fight it? And to not feel all the time like, yeah, I'm going to go kill all the zombies, because then you're out of that horror space. Then you're not scared anymore. You're just, going to go and you're going to Rambo your way through the hordes of zombies and monsters, and you're not going to really feel that fear and those emotions that these games used to evoke. Another problem that I've seen in some of these more recent games is making the enemies too fast. And I think this is a trend that has been happening. I definitely noticed it in the latest Resident Evil game. I definitely noticed it in the latest Dead Space game. And it takes something away from the atmosphere for me. Instead of having that tension of this enemy that has the potential to kill me, and it's sort of slowly making its way toward me, and I'm having that feeling of like, oh my gosh, it's getting closer, I gotta kill it. They're just, 3 or 4 rushing at your face at all times. And I think that shifts you from this psychological space where, in the former, where the enemies are slow but deadly, where it's like, okay, I have this thing and it's coming at me, and it really increases this sort of level of tension of like, well, I need to kill it before it gets to me, or I need to run away from it, or I need to figure a way how to, like, run around it and get a good angle on it, that sort of thing. It's tense, right? Versus this sort of adrenaline-fueled, reactionary action of, 3 things are rushing at your face at all times, and it's less, I think, in a way that I would consider true fear, and true tension, and more of, like I said, it's more working off of your adrenaline and reaction time and reaction speed, versus, having that time to truly sort of build up tension and fear. The next problem that I've seen is that with increasingly good mechanics for some of these games, it feels like they're leaning toward becoming more of an action or shooter, game rather than a survival game. So I think my point here is that just because the mechanics are good doesn't mean that you have to make it a shooter. It's like, yes, I appreciate good mechanics. I appreciate being able to aim my gun and shoot it. I appreciate being able to, hold that steel pipe and swing it and have it, swing when I want it to swing and go where I want it to go. But just because I have that ability, that doesn't mean that it has to be an action game or that it has to be a shooter. I think that those two things are separate. Good mechanics and the type of gameplay are not necessarily the same thing. You can have good shooting mechanics, but, limit the amount that you are actually able to shoot by, just things like I said before, limiting the ammo, limiting the weapons, limiting the weapon power, and balancing the enemies that you're facing so that, you might consider running away. If the enemies are sort of slow-moving and shambling or whatever, and you can get around them and your ammo is scarce or maybe your weapon deteriorates or something, you have to balance the decision making, right, of, well, am I going to try to fight this enemy and potentially waste my resources, or am I going to try to get around them? And so I think that's where they can change that up, that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have imprecise mechanics to the combat system. You can still have a good combat system and still implement that into a game that is based more on survival and decision making than on shooting and action all the time. Next problem in this generation is too many enemies. I don't need 10 things coming at me at all times to make it scary for me. Like I was talking about before, it's often that anticipation of what might be there that's much more scary and much more tense than the presence of more and more things. Because once you have these hordes of things coming at you at all times, it becomes just pure action. Once there is a room full of things that I need to kill, and I know that that's what I need to do with them, there's no running away, there's there's no getting out of it. That's not the goal. The goal is simply to kill everything. It just becomes like any other shooter or any other action game. Another thing that I think that these games did well back in the day was to make it so that it wasn't so much reliant upon this sort of cheap scares, like something jumping out, something grabbing you, a loud noise, or something crashing behind you, or something like that. Yes, those elements were there, and I think that, those things do add to that atmosphere of sort of keeping you on your toes, keeping you tense, what might be there. So I think that that's not necessarily the wrong things to be putting in these games, but I don't think that everything should rely on that. Like, the entire scare factor should not be based on, well, what can we have jump out at you that's going to startle you? Because to me, the first time or, second time you play through the game, yeah, those things might still startle you, because you don't know that it's coming, or you've forgotten exactly when something jumps out or whatever. But after a while, sometimes that just becomes irritating, because I know that, like in Dead Space 3, for example, I always expected something to be popping out. I always expected something to be behind me. And generally it always was. And so when you're expecting that to be there, it's not scary anymore. It just becomes irritating that, okay, well, I know something's going to be behind me, and then it is, and they get in a cheap shot on you or something. To me, that's not scary. To me, that's just irritating, and it feels like sort of a cheap trick. And then once that moment of being startled is over, I'm not scared anymore. I'm just killing things. It's not this constant presence of, oh my gosh, Pyramid Head is down here. What am I going to do? I can't kill him. I need to run away. Oh no, 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 where is he gonna be? I can hear the radio going off. Ah! And so it's not that real, you know, place where you are actually, you know, fearing something or feeling that sense of tension. It's just more of a momentary snap response, and I think that the majority of the scares shouldn't be reliant upon that. I think that a way that they could move from that sort of, oh, I'm gonna just have something pop out here and it's gonna scare you aspect of these games is to have a degree of randomness to them. You know, I remember walking through the streets on Silent Hill 2 just recently, and you know, the enemies didn't always spawn at the same place, and they weren't always the same ones. There was a degree where it was random. You know, you would expect that, oh, there are going to be these monsters that are going to spawn in the hallways or on the street as you're walking through. But they weren't always the same, you know. Every time I went through, for example, the hospital level, and I would exit out of a room into a corridor, you know, there may or may not be enemies that have respawned there. And I don't know, I think that that's good because it sort of, it keeps you on your toes, right? And it keeps this constant feeling of like, well, something might be there, rather than, you know, always needing to anticipate, okay, so there's going to be 3 things that jump at you in this room, and then when you go out into the hall, there's going to be 1 more, and then when you walk down and go into the third door on the left, there's going to be 2 more. You know, to a degree, you can keep those sorts of things in mind because some areas are set. You know, there will be a set number of enemies in specific rooms, and some rooms you know that there won't be anything there if you've played through before and you've sort of made note of that. But a lot of times within the environment itself, so within the hallways, within the open areas, within the streets, there was some randomness, and you weren't always sure what was going to be there and how many there would be and what type of enemy it would be. And I think with, you know, Resident Evil and Dead Space, the newer iterations of those, you know, it is sort of set. I mean, I think there might be a degree of randomness, like with the mutations, whether things mutate on Dead Space and Resident Evil, but, you know, as far as, well, there's going to be this number of zombies, and whenever you walk by this one, it's going to get up. And so having that sort of linearity, like, it's consistent, you know it's going to be that way, it takes a little bit of that edge off of it. You know, you definitely aren't as tense the second time playing through, and I think they tried to compensate for that with making the enemies really fast and there being a lot of them, and, you know, they're always in your face and there's a million of them. But I think that that's not as scary for me as that little degree of randomness where every time I open a door into the hallway, I'm like, is there gonna be something there? I think that these newer games, they can still use some of the things that the older games used. Like, for example, putting you in a claustrophobic space with a really powerful enemy that maybe is kind of slow. You know, you can dance around them, but it will freaking murder you, you know, if you don't deal with it correctly. So, you know, I'm thinking about a lot of these boss fights in Silent Hill 2. I didn't necessarily love them because the camera angles were often very poor. But I imagine that with better camera angles, with better controls, they could be really great, you know, putting you in a small room with a really powerful enemy where you really need to run around them and, you know, play your corners and know when to shoot and know when to run away so that you don't get hit. I mean, that's awesome. You know, that's tense. You're running around this little square room and you have this huge thing that has a huge knife that can just kill you. And you're trying to, you know, okay, gotta get around it. Oh no, I have to reload. Why? Don't hit me. I think that that's great. You know, and I think that it could be even better with better camera angles and with better control systems and with better combat systems. That doesn't take away from the fear of that situation of being in a tight space with something that will just murder you. You know, and a lot of times the enemies, I mean, they're slow. Pyramid Head is slow. He's carrying a really huge knife and he's got this like really huge metal thing on his head. So he's slow. But he is imposing and he makes you afraid because he will kill you if he gets close. So you're never in that situation thinking, oh yeah, I'm not scared, I got this. I mean, you might after playing it a few times and sort of really getting the timing down on the enemy and really knowing what you're doing. But I don't know, it still always feels like that sense of threat. So using things like that, where the enemy is not necessarily really fast, but is really powerful, and you really have to, you know, be in close proximity to them at all times, I think is something that they could still use in a lot of these games. I also think that rewarding and punishing exploration at the same time is something that games these days could continue to do. You know, that system, it works really well. You're in this situation where you need ammo, you need weapons, you need health items, but you don't necessarily want to stray too far from the main path because there are things that can kill you there and you don't want to be close to them. You know, just having that moment of decision, I think, is a victory for a survival horror game. You know, where you have to think for a second, do I want to go down that hallway? Do I want to go into that room to see if there's, you know, something there that I could use? If you have to make that decision, if that's not just an automatic, well, yeah, of course I'm going to go into that room and explore it. If there's a momentary hesitation where you are thinking, well, maybe I don't want to go in there because there might be something in there, then they've won already. Because at that point, you are having to make a choice. And that choice is based on, well, I could have a really great reward if I go into this room and there's something that I can really use. Or I could go in here and it could be really bad for me because there could be something really bad in that room. You know, when the game has set up that expectation for you where, well, maybe there will be something good in here, maybe there won't. Maybe there'll be enemies, maybe there won't. Then they have you. They've caught you. They've got you in that mindset. And I think that is definitely something where that can be taken advantage of in games even now, where you're both rewarded for exploration and punished for it at the same time. The last thing that I wanted to touch on was the use of co-op and or AI partners. And so, this I know is a really divisive thing for, you know, true survival horror fans. A lot of times I hear and see people saying things like, well, if I have someone there with me, it's not scary anymore. If it's co-op, then I'm not afraid. If I have an AI partner even, then I'm not afraid, and I don't want this to be an escort mission for the entire game. You know, I heard lots of things criticized for that. I think, you know, I've heard Resident Evil 4 described as just a giant escort mission, and the AI character being very annoying. I've definitely heard the AI character from Resident Evil 5 as being very annoying. And, you know, I think that they want to tread carefully on that, you know. The majority of the time in the old school survival horror games, you were alone. Your player character was by him or herself. It gives it that sense of isolation that I think really plays into the feeling of these games, you know, because often when you are fighting for someone, when you are trying to protect someone else, or when you're working together with someone to overcome an obstacle, you feel this sense of obligation, right? And so I think naturally as human beings and having, you know, empathy for other people, I think that plays into it because you're no longer just focused on your own survival. When there's someone else there, whether it's an AI character, and especially if it's a human character, especially if that's someone that you know and are talking to and communicating with, it sort of overrides that self-protective nature that we have. You know, whenever we're in a group, we're sort of wired to, you know, want to help each other. Cooperation is something that in our evolution has been rewarded. And not to get too sciencey, it's just something that we're wired to do. And so it overrides that sort of selfishness, that self-protective feeling, and we become focused on, you know, protecting that other person. You become focused on working together with that other person so that you both survive. And I think that takes away from the fear response, you know. Not that you can't still be afraid if you're with someone, but I don't think it's quite the same because of, you know, that self versus others perspective taking that you will have. This isn't to say that I think that co-op and AI partners can't exist in a game that is still a survival horror game, but I think that they have to really be done well. You know, you don't want a partner that is going to detract from the experience. I think even when AI partners are done well, it still sort of detracts from that horror feeling because you lose that sense of isolation that you have when your character is alone, and it becomes more like, you know, a buddy cop action sequence than a situation where you're really just trying to survive. And I think that that's just the nature of how those AI partners have been implemented in these kinds of games thus far. And finally, talking about co-op, I love co-op. I'm a big proponent of co-op, so I would never tell a game to, hey, don't give me co-op, because I want co-op. I like co-op. I like being able to go in there and play with someone else. What I would say is make co-op optional and do it in a way where it feels like you can have a true single player experience and you can have a true co-op experience, and those things are separate. I think that what Dead Space 3 did with their co-op system is close to that. I think that they had some balance issues where it was really balanced toward co-op, and then the single player felt like there were too many enemies that were too difficult to kill, because the balance just wasn't quite there. But I think that the idea was along the right lines, where you can have that single player experience, your character's alone, you don't have an AI partner, but if you want one of your friends to play through it with you, you can have that experience too, and then sort of magically their character is with you in all of these situations where you were alone before. So I think that that one works pretty well. I think that something that I would love to see is figuring out a way to do co-op but to make it scary, because I really think that when you're playing a game and it's the same exact experience by yourself versus with someone else, it's always just going to be less scary when you're with somebody else. And so maybe figuring out a way to have co-op in one of these kinds of games, but have it maybe implemented a little bit different. So maybe you're in separate sort of stories, but they intersect a little bit, and you're communicating with each other sometimes. And, you know, maybe one person is along their own story and along their own trajectory, but something they do can affect the other player. So maybe something that they do in their game, if they solve a puzzle, or if they, you know, turn on the power here, or if they manage to take out you know, some of the monsters or enemies in their game, it can affect the way that their quote-unquote partner is doing on their side, you know, so that maybe you're both sort of doing your own thing, but the things that you're doing in your section of the game is affecting the things that are happening in the other player's side. So, like, you know, while one person is off investigating this office building, the other person is in the sewers or something, and so you're in completely different areas, and you're sort of having to communicate back and forth and figure out a way to help each other. You know, that's just kind of an idea of something that maybe they could try that I haven't seen before, where you still get that sense of isolation, but you also are working together. You know, I would love to see them try different things like that to try to keep the tension there, but still allow me to play with my friends. And this kind of thing isn't something that's going to be perfect. I'm sure that if they do try to incorporate things like that, it'll take a lot of effort, you know, and a lot of testing, and a lot of coming up with things that aren't quite exactly right before they figure out a way to implement it successfully. But I think that it's worth that, because I do think that there are plenty of people who love these kinds of games and still want to experience them with someone else, that it would be worth it to try something like that. So, in short, to sum up, I love survival horror games. I think that the developers of these series have gone down a bad path lately, making them a little bit more action-oriented, and getting caught up in the idea that, oh, we have better mechanics, we have better systems, we can add in all of these action components that maybe they couldn't before just because of the constraints, and have taken it into this direction that a lot of people are criticizing. And so I think that good survival horror is still possible. I think that there just needs to be a shift in the idea of what makes a good survival horror game. And I think that setting the atmosphere and limiting your resources are the number one and number two things for making that happen. And I think that those absolutely can still happen in games that are coming out now. I just don't think that a lot of them are doing it very well. So that's what's pushing my buttons this week. Please let me know what you think about survival horror, where you think it can go. Do you like these games now, or did you ever like them? I want to hear from you, and I will see you next time.